Hi guys, Matt Hickey from Pit Lane Parlay here with Frenchy, Michael Goodyear, our Formula One contributor on Pit Lane Parlay. Frenchy, how you doing today?
And well, enjoyed the race earlier today. It was fun to watch.
Yes, the American Grand Prix just finished today. We are doing an early holiday preview for all of you race fans out there, Formula One, IndyCar. We are going to be running through some books that you can buy for yourself or your loved ones this holiday season. Frenchie, lo and behold, is like an expert on this. He quite literally has several bookshelves full of Formula One and IndyCar books, more so on the Formula One side, but we are going to run through some suggestions of his, either ones to buy or ones to avoid, and then kind of like a top tier list of ones that you absolutely should buy. So make sure you follow us along at Pit Lane Parlay on all the social medias and let us know if Frenchie's got a good radar for this so that we can take that feedback and make sure to send him more materials for next time so you can keep plugging some books here. So we'll start wherever you want. What's the first one up on the docket here?
I'd say let's start with just some general Formula One books that I've read. I tend to lean towards biographies or autobiographies, but there are a couple of more general or like season length books that just focus on a storyline more than a person that have
Okay.
been pretty good. And two of those are Checkered Conflict by
Oh,
Morris Hamilton, which looks at the 2007 and 1986 championships and kind of compares the two as they go along. So we're talking the crazy three-way battle between Prost, PK, and Mansell in 86, and then the 2007 season with Raikkonen, Hamilton, and Alonso, and just kind of the whole crazy scandals, including the McLaren Spygate thing that happened in 2007. It chronicles it all really extensive detail.
was there any crazy scandals from the 86 season that are touched on in the book?
Not really crazy scandals, just more the tense relationship between PK and Mansell as it sort of started to deteriorate. He'd come in 86 PK to Williams, and it just really started to go downhill from there. And the rivalry was pretty intense. And obviously, Frank Williams and Patrick Head just chose to let them kind of go at it.
Which is a strategy, I guess, if you're a Formula One manager. And the 86 was when Mansell also blew out his tire at Adelaide. Is that the right year?
Yep, exactly. So
Okay.
it's the year that Prost took the title just basically by being able to finish ahead of Mansell and PK because of those tire issues with Goodyear.
And then as far as the '07 scandal, was there anything that you learned from the book that you hadn't already know? Was there any like tidbits that you're like, wow, I didn't know that part of it?
Yeah, it goes into a lot of detail. I think Maurice Hamilton used to be a journalist. I forget where he was a journalist, to be honest, but he's written a lot of Formula One books, so he's kind of an author to look up. And this was just my favorite one that he'd written. But he was covering the scandal at the time, and so he has some correspondence with some of the individuals involved that he includes in the book. That's really interesting to read.
That's cool. So just FYI for those listening, if you check our bio, we will have all the information on the books that are discussed here and where you can find them if it's Amazon or a publishing site or whatnot. What was the other book that you kind of lumped into this category?
This one's called Survive, Drive, Win by Nick Fry.
Okay.
And Nick Fry was actually the head of Honda Formula One,
Ooh,
and then became I guess it's the chief executive officer of Braun GP, while
nice.
Ross Braun was the team principal. So this is his inside story about that 2009 season and just
Nice.
the kind of craziness that went along with the buyout from Honda and Jenson Button winning the title, all that.
The greatest deal in the history of Formula One, buying Honda for what, like a pound?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's the still the greatest deal in the history of ever. All right, so those are two good Formula One books. What's the next one up?
Um, I'd say I'm gonna give you guys one to avoid. Um, that I think like I said, I tend to go for the biographies or autobiographies, and I expected this one to be really good. And maybe don't avoid it, but just kind of don't expect it to be as good as some of the ones I'll mention later. And that's David Coulthard's book. It is what it is. Um, it really just came across to me that he's pretty vain. And I mean, I guess to be a top level athlete, you have to have self confidence, but he talks a lot about sleeping with various women, and he just kind of makes excuses for why he wasn't competitive with Mika Hakkinen, or just seems to complain a lot in the book, find reasons for that. And there are a lot of hot takes that he makes in this book. I think it's kind of an interesting read, but not in terms of you're going to like him more or you're going to really enjoy the book. It's almost your mouth is kind of hitting the floor with every chapter.
So is there a Cliff Notes version as to why he wasn't as good as Hakkinen? Yeah, according to him.
Yeah, he basically says that he wasn't favored by McLaren, that Ron Dennis favored Mika Hakkinen always. And so that's why he didn't do as well, that he basically was never in the right mental state and was always looking over his shoulder, is his argument.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll go with that.
Yeah.
All right. So there's one to maybe take with a grain of salt, but definitely read at your own caution, we'll say. What's up next?
Up next, I actually have a couple of IndyCar ones to mention before we get to sort of my favorites. And one of the, I think, lesser known but better IndyCar books I've read is actually by David Malsher Lopez. It's a biography about Will Power. This is a super good book. And David Malsher Lopez is just an amazing writer. So I think that's what makes it so interesting. But I mean, Will Power is an amazing character. This book was written a few years ago, so it's not up to date on his career. It's missing like his 500 win. But it's a really interesting read about it, where he came up and sort of his background, because obviously he's a unique character and it's just fun to read.
So if you're a fan at home who doesn't like Will Power, or someone who, we're going to be honest here and say that Will Power has given people ammunition in the past to give people a reason to dislike him. I think I was there at one point. My parents are there or were there at one point. They respect the hell out of him as a driver, and I think everybody does as a driver, but sometimes some of his antics go a little far. After reading that book, did you feel like you changed your perspective about Will Power at all?
Yeah, I think it paints him as much more of a human than we tend to see in the media. He tends to be kind of aloof or just kind of almost weird when he does interviews, because I think he's got his race focus on. And he's just somebody who's, I think, very just an intense person, but he definitely has a sense of humor and like another more human side to him that I think comes through in the book.
Sweet. And we're big fans of David Malsher Lopez on the podcast. He's a very good journalist, very good at his job. So I'm going to definitely give him the benefit of the doubt and assume that book's very good. One more question, not to put you on the spot per se, but was there anything from that book that was about a different driver that caught you off guard?
I think maybe not about another driver, but I think in the beginning when Power was driving for Derek Walker and Team Australia, that was very interesting dynamic, and to kind of learn a little bit about the difficulties of Derek Walker trying to make that team work as Champ Car was kind of coming to an end, right? Was pretty interesting to read about.
Was it just like trying to keep it afloat or trying to keep everybody happy, or?
Yeah, all of the above. It sounded like a really terrible time to be a team owner, especially given all that Derek Walker had put into the sport and how successful he had been.
Because was he still like CEO at the time? Or
yeah,
was he out by then?
No, I think he was.
Okay. So yeah, that would complicate it. So that's interesting. And Simon Pageant was his teammate in 07 too in Champ Car. So yeah, that's probably a good book to read if you're a Will Power fan, or if you're someone who maybe wants to learn more about Will Power, give that a look. Any other IndyCar books?
Yeah, I've got a couple more. One, I would say Beast is obviously like the gold standard for IndyCar books, pretty much. If you haven't read this, I recommend highly going out to get it, because Jade Gerst and the level of detail he goes into with the Penske Mercedes engine project, the pushrod engine for the 94 500, it's really good.
Yeah, no shame in admitting this on my part, but since 8th grade, I have read 3 books in my life, and that is one of them, The Beast. I absolutely loved it. So that's actually one that I can actually speak to knowledge about. And I don't know about you, but one of my favorite facts of that book was not about Team Penske 94 at all or anything like that. It was about Pat Patrick basically trying to steal the engine from Ilmore in '89 when he switched to Alfa Romeo 1990, and that's how engine leases became a thing. So that like when you're a team owner and you have an engine in your car, you only get to use the engine for your car, but you don't get to like get any of the technological details or um, the specifications or anything like that. So that was interesting. I don't know if you thought that was got well, not like funny, but it made you chuckle a little, just like, oh, that's how that became a thing.
No, it definitely did. Just the kind of gall that took him to almost send a full engine over to, wherever he was trying to send it. I guess it was Alfa Romeo to try
Yeah,
to
as
figure out
Alpha.
how to pick apart the Ilmore. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you think nowadays how illegal that would be. I mean, no, I probably legal. It was more of like maybe frowned upon back then as like intellectual property, but like nowadays you get sued to the end of the earth for doing that. So, ooh, yeah, that was funny. Anyways, what do you got? What do you got next?
Well, given that you read Beast, I definitely recommend this is new that just came out, and I just got this and finished it recently. The Al Unser Jr. book, which is also written by Jade Gers, is amazing. Whether you like Al Jr. or not, you should read this because I think it will change your opinion of him as a person. I was never a huge Al Jr. fan. Just I don't know. I mean, I respect his driving talent, but he was just never my favorite driver. But this really paints him as a human being. I think again, going back to the Will Power book, it gives a whole different side to the man and his issues as well as his triumphs and sort of how he has progressed through his career.
So I have seen that book. I've been trying to get it, and every time I go on Amazon, it's sold out, unfortunately. So still keeping my eyes out on that one. My dad is the biggest Al Unser Jr. fan in the world, so I know he's really looking forward to reading it at some point. Does it talk at all about? I'm assuming it does, but does it? Because obviously I haven't read it yet. Does it talk at all about his struggles from the '95 Indy 500 at all and getting bumped?
Yeah. I mean, they talk about his Formula One test, talks about his problems with substance abuse. It talks about how Tony George paid him a salary to go drive in the IRL when he came back. All these kind of things.
Wasn't that
It
Patrick
was,
Racing too in '04?
it was Gallus, wasn't it, that he went back to?
Oh yeah, so '01. Yes. Yep. Or it was like 2000 or something. So yeah, crazy times back in the split days when he jumped from Penske to Gallus. So and then I think it was Kelly Racing thereafter. So yeah, so that's definitely a new one to check out. So if you are looking for a new book out there to recommend to a relative, that's one. All right, so what's next up on your recommendations here?
So the last IndyCar related book and another newish one that I want to talk about was Indy Split. I keep getting
Ah.
reflection on these, but just going back to kind of the inside of obviously kart versus IRL and whichever side you're on, this book gives all the dirty details of how, that fracture came to be and then, how each series was able to survive as long as they did before ultimately obviously rejoining.
So that's by racing journalist John Orievich. Do
Yes.
did you read that and think any more or less of Tony George?
Um, to be honest, and this is probably going to get me in trouble with some individuals, I was always on the kart side of things.
I didn't
So
know
if you're an
for.
IRL fan, I'm sorry. I mean, I appreciate both. So I would say it maybe didn't make me think less of Tony George. It made me just kind of see how petty both sides were being, how petty the kart side was as well, how all the individuals involved in that, and how they really should have just tried a little bit harder to come together, but they just kept basically feeling alienated from each other or, taking offense to things I think that were kind of small, it seems like in the scheme of things.
Yeah, I don't know if that would work nowadays with social media. I think there'd be too much public backlash on social media to get away with that kind of crap nowadays. I mean, obviously there's still things that happen in the sports world that could be avoided, but the social media backlash and the ability for anybody out there to go on a platform and express your outrage towards a group or an individual about something. It's a lot easier than it was obviously in 1996 or 1995, whenever it's started to get the ball rolling. Because back then it was just, mailing a letter to IMS telling them they're a bunch of frauds and things like that. So yes, that one recently came out, I think within the last year.
Yeah.
My dad does have a copy of that, so I'm going to need to steal it at some point. All right, so let's get to, so we've had some great recommendations so far, but let's get to your top 4 must-read items that you want to recommend to the individuals out there. So what's coming in at number 4?
But number 4, and these are all Formula One related, just because for some reason it seems like there are so many more books written about Formula One and drivers. It's harder to find IndyCar books, I think. So if any of you guys have recommendations for something I didn't mention or a good one, I'd love to hear it because I always want to read more about IndyCar. And number 4 is Johnny Herbert's biography, What Doesn't Kill You. I thought this was really good. Obviously, Johnny Herbert is kind of known as a little bit of a jokester, has a sense of humor, and that really comes through in this book. It's funny. It'll make you laugh, in the book. You can hear his voice as he's kind of writing it. And just going through his accident in Formula 3000 to coming back and driving for Benetton and having to deal with, I can't think of his name now.
Who's it? Briatore? Schumacher?
Yeah, Flavio Briatore. And then just going through his Formula One career, being Michael Schumacher's teammate, Benetton, all these things. It was really interesting. And another really interesting that came out of this book is that he wanted to do IndyCar. And he actually did a few IndyCar tests, did oval racing tests. And I never knew that he was actually so into it. I know he had tried to qualify for an Indy 500 at one point, but he was really trying to do it full time.
Really?
And he talks about that in the book.
Because I know he smashed the attenuator one year, if I remember correctly. Did you think it was all curious that he wasn't really included in the Schumacher documentary?
Yeah, I did, because it seems like he was one of Schumacher's closest teammates. I would say even closer than Barrichello was. I'd argue that Brundle and Herbert were probably the closest teammates to Schumacher, but we can always argue that. But I thought it was interesting that he wasn't really included. He seems to kind of shy away from talking all that much about Schumacher. It doesn't seem like they were very close or friends.
Yeah, and from what little I know, it seems like there's a lot of politicking from Schumacher and his camp about making sure Schumacher got preferential treatment. So
yeah,
if you're making a documentary that's trying to cast him in a good light, I imagine it makes sense why maybe he wasn't included, but still would like to get his perspective on things and whatnot. But that's coming in at number 4. What about number 3 on Frenchy's Christmas holiday extravaganza book list?
So sorry about the big sticker on this. Obviously, it's a British copy of the book, but I think Damon Hill's biography, Watching the Wheels, is one of the best books I've ever read in terms of just honesty. He really just comes across and tells you, what it was like to go through being the son of an ex-Formula One driver and living in his shadow. And he talks about his mental health struggles so honestly that it's really refreshing to hear about somebody who's, I think an elite athlete, and, obviously the 96 Formula One world champion, but just how these people have weaknesses too. And I think that was the refreshing part of this book, apart from just the details of driving in the 90s, in that beautiful Rothmans Williams.
Yeah, because you got to imagine his 2 first full-time teammates were Alan Prost, and then follows Ayrton Senna, and then also that overhanging expectation since he is, the son of a champion. I just can't imagine all that crap he had to go through. And then, 94 with Senna's death and the championship with Schumacher. And then wasn't really much of a fight in 95, if I remember correctly.
No.
But then 96 came around, and then he had to fend off Villeneuve while also dealing with the fact that he was getting pushed out of the team. Yeah, I can't imagine all the crap he had to go through. So definitely going to gain some insights there if you're a Formula One fan. So definitely check that out. All right. Who's coming in at first runner up?
I think first runner up is this book called Team Lotus, My View from the Pit Wall by Peter War, who was the team manager for Lotus
Oh, really?
during the 80s and 90s.
Oh, really?
So it's not about the as a particular driver per se, but this is Lotus from, I'd say, early 80s, just after Colin Chapman passed away. And even before that, because he was working for Colin Chapman for a period of time through the early 90s. And it goes through Senna, all the people that Nelson Piquet, everybody that drove for Lotus, and just really interesting insight into keeping this team going. And being a competitive team, but a little bit in the shadow of Williams and McLaren there in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, because that was one of those driver moves predicted correctly on Senna's part, switching from Lotus to McLaren just at the right time when McLaren boomed and Lotus started to go down a little bit. Herbert raced with Lotus, I believe, at a certain point. Zanardi, Hakkinen.
Yeah, Mansell. He has a very negative opinion of Nigel Mansell in this book. That's one of my favorite quotes. It's something about Nigel Mansell has a persecution complex. Like, he always thinks that people are trying to be after him and like discredit him. It's really funny to read what he thinks about Nigel Mansell.
Oh, all right. So if you're looking for more of a throwback insight into a team, and especially a historic team like Lotus was, that definitely sounds like a really fun read. So you can definitely brush up on some knowledge there for sure. All right. Who takes the gold medal for your recommendations here?
I think I almost chose this because it's so obscure and it surprised me so much, but it's a book about Didier Pironi. And the Champion That Never Was is what it's called, by David Sedgwick. Okay. I knew little to nothing about Pironi, but this is one of the best books I've ever read. He has such an interesting story. And just learning about a driver who, it seemed like he really convinced me that Pironi was a lost talent, almost to the level of Gilles Villeneuve.
Really?
Yeah.
So for those who may not know a whole lot about Didier Pironi, including me, who knows of the name but might need a refresher real quick on like who exactly he was, what's kind of like a Cliff Notes version of like the backstory and where maybe his career went wrong?
So he raced for Tyrrell and Ferrari, and won, I think, 3 races for Ferrari. And he was teammates with Gilles Villeneuve in the early 80s.
Okay.
And they had that whole disagreement, I believe, at San Marino at Imola, where there was supposed to be an agreement about whoever led a certain lap would go on to win the race, and you like wouldn't fight on teammates. Thing. Exactly. Which I know that you and host Mike absolutely adore.
Yep.
And then Villeneuve thought that Pironi kind of didn't honor that agreement. And so they never spoke again. And then unfortunately, Villeneuve passed away a few races later. And this is in 82. And then Pironi crashes a few races after that and injures his legs to the point where he's recovering for the next 4 years before he dies in a powerboat accident.
Jeez.
So he was someone, I think, that could have been the 82 world champion over Keke Rosberg, because he had won 2 races that year. Had he been able to finish the championship. And then his career was just really cut short because his legs were so badly damaged in an accident.
So was he competitive powerboat racing, or was that just like a hobby? Or
yeah, he wanted to do competitive powerboat racing. That was sort of his way to try to get back into some kind of competition, I think. And then there was an accident with several people on board the boat.
Man, I didn't know any of that. I knew the name. Unfortunately, like that era of Formula One, like anything before 84, unfortunately, is a little out of my realm, but kind of makes you sit back. And I'm not trying to get philosophical here, but makes you kind of sit back and think like petty stuff, like not talking to someone and then having them pass away. I would feel terrible after that. So kind of one of those, sure, there was probably a miscommunication and some frustration, but something that could have been worked out so that both of them could go about their day and not have to worry about it, kind of thing.
Yeah. And I mean, just hearing about Gilles Villeneuve is interesting. And I have his book on my shelf that I have to get to at some point. He's coming up with Alain Prost, René Arnoux, Jacques Lafitte, all these guys that were in Formula One from France in this period, and just how competitive it was during that time in the 80s. And also just the switch from non-turbo to turbo power is also interesting to read. and how powerful the tobacco companies were. All that stuff about old Formula One just really interests me.
Awesome. Awesome. So there's a lot of good books that you just recommended. We may have to do a version of this next year when you get to more books and more publications, either from this last year or just stuff that's recommended or stuff that you haven't gotten to yet. But we really appreciate your expertise on this. And if you want to check out our bio for all of the titles that were mentioned, and if you want to message us at Pit Lane Parlay on Twitter or at mgoodier007. I'm at Hickey93. If you want to leave comments, direct message, tweet at us what you guys think of his recommendations, or if there's any of the books you mentioned that you absolutely love and can back it up, or if you hate David Coulthard, just let us know, and we'd be happy to see what you guys have to say out there. So, Frenchy, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it, and we hope you guys have a good one.